I want to talk to you, as has been announced. Ryan announced that the lesson this evening is basically, why do bad things happen to good people? We're talking about faith. And tonight we're talking about a question that really challenges our faith. And with some people, it just puts a great big question mark on their faith. This is a lesson I do in a series sometimes. Sometimes Julie and I'll do some weekend stuff with various congregations on grief and all of that sort of thing. And she talks to the ladies and I talk to the guys, and then combined I'll talk to everybody. But there was a church in Birmingham where we were going to do some of this material, and they had made a really neat little flyer and all this kind of thing. And it said, we would like to welcome Wilson and Julie Adams for this weekend. And they said, and this is what it said on the flyer: Wilson and Julie Adams have a passion for hurting people. So you can take that either way. You can take that any way you want, but that's what it said. Why do bad things happen to good people? I think there are some people who have a very difficult time believing that evil is real, that evil exists in our world. But it does. And the Bible doesn't try to hide that reality from us. Even in the 23rd Psalm, in verse 4, it says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. How many of the Old Testament kings does it say, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord? In Matthew 6 and verse 13, Jesus, when he was teaching us how to pray, said, pray and say, deliver us from evil. In Romans 12 and verse 17, he says, never pay back evil for evil. And then again in verse 21 of the same Romans chapter, he says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 29 and verse 30, in a list of things that are of Satan, a list of behaviors that are heinous to God, he says in verse 29, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil. And then look at verse 30. Slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, and then Paul says this, inventors of evil. Inventors of evil. Just about the time that you think that Satan has invented all of the evil he could ever invent, he finds a new way, a brand new way to market his product. Evil, ladies and gentlemen, is real. September the 11th and 2001, even to this day, to those who are old enough to remember, strikes a responsive emotional chord in all of us. Because the evil of that day had such a monumental impact on the heart and the soul of an entire nation that even unto this day, there's really no words to describe the feeling that most Americans had that day. You could use the word shock, but it was more than that. You could use the word outrage, but it went beyond that. You could use the word fear, and I think that would be an appropriate term, but it was a kind of fear, the depth of which we had not known before. It was such a terror that it just sent an entire nation into silence. And so we sat through the entire day with our eyes glued to the television screen, and we did not know what to say, and we did not know how to say it, and so we just sat in silent shock. You remember that? There are some days you never forget. And yet it is the same terrifying silence that grips us. when we hear the latest report of another action of senseless violence of some kind. And we have names and places in our vocabulary today that mean something different than it used to mean, or maybe it wasn't there at all before. Columbine, Virginia Tech, Fort Hood, Tucson, Aurora, Newtown, San Bernardino, Las Vegas. And you can just go on, and the list is just lengthy. And suddenly images flood our minds of innocent people minding their own business who are struck down for no sensible reason. And we scratch our heads and we wonder why, but we cannot wonder for very long, because there will be another and another. And it doesn't happen in just faraway places like New York City or Washington, D.C. and places like that. It can happen to anyone in any place at any time. Doesn't matter where you are. You can be at work, you can be at school, you can be in a shopping center of some kind, and you can become the target of a senseless action of violence. And we raise the question, and our next door neighbors raise the question, where is the sense in senseless tragedy? How do I make sense of something that doesn't make any sense? How do I do that? And it rocks the faith of a lot of people. And I'll tell you the importance of this lesson, because every time there is something like that that happens, it gives us a great opportunity to talk to people about God as they ask us questions, because they know we are people of faith. And so they invariably come to us and say, well, now how could God? And the conversation goes from there. But you know, the problem is not that something bad has happened to innocent people. Because I think all of us understand that kind of thing happens every single day. Here's a car and it's going down the freeway, and suddenly it has a blowout on a tire, goes out of control, skids out of control, goes over an embankment, and then it goes down and lands upside down in a river, and here's a family that can't get out and they drown. It's an accident. But accidents happen every single day. But the problem is, these kinds of things seem to happen so randomly that we're left asking the question, why? I mean, if there is suffering in the world, and there is, if there is suffering in the world, then we want some kind of logical reason for it. We want some measure of predictability for it. We want to be able to make some kind of preparation for it. It's what I call the apparent randomness of suffering that just seems so senseless and so terrifying to us. Veterans of war understand exactly what I'm talking about. This terror of randomness. Because here are two soldiers and they're walking on patrol. And one soldier is struck down by a sniper's bullet, and his buddy right next to him is left unharmed. Or one soldier steps on a landmine, and his buddy right next to him is unharmed. The arbitrariness of death on the battlefield has brought many a soldier back stateside asking this question: why? Why? And all of us are left with the emptiness of helplessness as we wrestle with this question that is often so unanswerable. And some people lose their faith because they can't answer all the questions. So, why do bad things happen to good people? You taking notes tonight? You taking notes tonight? You got it? All right, he told me last night he was taking notes. Okay, here we go. I'm going to give you, we're going to make this real simple. I'm going to ask two questions. I'm going to ask you two questions. And then I'm going to tell you two stories. And then I'm going to leave you with two truths. Two questions, two stories, two truths. All right, here we go. Two questions. Two questions. The first question we've already hinted at. And the first question is the question we ask initially and immediately anytime something happens that we don't understand, and that is the question, why? Why? You ever stop to think, why do we ask the why question? You ever ask that question? Why do we ask why? And I'll tell you the answer to the question. We ask why, I think, because we have expectations of the orderliness of life. It's what we expect. I mean, in nature reflects order and orderliness. It's observable. You can drop an object off the table and it is going to fall at the same rate of speed every time because of the order of the universe. The God who made the world set gravity in motion. And so there is order in our created world. In Genesis chapter 8 and verse 22, look at the order that God prescribed. He said, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. And so it is from the beginning of time that God has ordered this world. And that's why this time of the year, farmers get out in the field with their tractors and they begin to plow and they begin to plant and they begin to get ready. And then in the fall they harvest, and they just don't get that mixed up. And it's not going to be very long before we're all going to be sitting around in July going, whoo, man, it's hot. I'll be glad when it gets cold again or cool. Well, wait till December or January, you'll get your wish. You know, it happens. Because it's the order of our world. And the same thing with day and night, and the same thing with everything else. God has ordered our world. You can come to the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 33, and it says, God is not the author of confusion. That's talking about the particular assembly in Corinth that was out of order, and Paul tried to get them back in order. But I want to tell you, God is the God of order of everything. And then we humans come along and we take it to another level and we impose additional order. And so we wear clocks on our wrists and we put clocks in every room in our house. I wish they'd leave the time change alone. It drives me crazy. It's going through the house and changing all the clocks. You know, you do that. You ever go about 2 weeks and then realize you missed one? You know? We want order in our world. And we get our calendars, we get stuff put in our phone, and we get everything scheduled out. We've got this appointment and this appointment and this appointment. We've got everything ordered precisely. Because we like order. But order doesn't always prevail, does it? Here's a family that lives comfortably in a Midwestern town, and suddenly their lives are shattered by a storm that drops out of the sky and destroys their home, and their neighbor's home is untouched. And their question is, where is the order in this? Here's a middle-aged man who eats right, who exercises because heart disease runs in his family, and so he's trying to take care of himself, and then he is diagnosed with cancer, and he wants to know, where is the order in this? Here is a woman who enjoys many happy years of marriage and motherhood, and she goes out jogging one morning on the Greenway and is abducted and raped. Where is the order in that? Here is a man who takes his family on a long-awaited vacation. They save up, they go to the Rocky Mountains. And they go around on a 2-lane road around a curve in Idaho, and they're met head-on by a drunk driver, and in an instant, his mother is killed, his wife is killed, and his daughter is killed. And that's a true story, by the way. And he wants to know, where's the order in that? Everyone in each of these situations asks the same question we all ask in any situation. Why? Why me? Why them? Why there? Why then? And I will tell you that is not an easy question to answer. And I will tell you sometimes there is not an answer from any perspective we have. And I found a verse in the book of Hebrews in chapter 2, in verse 13, that is my go-to when things happen and I don't know the answer. Tucked away in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 13 is a quotation out of Isaiah chapter 8. And it just simply says this: I will put my trust in Him. I looked at that one day and I thought, that's it. And I got my yellow highlighter out and I marked that phrase. And I got my red pen out and my ruler and I underlined that phrase. Because that's it right there. I will put my trust in Him. Even when things happen that I don't understand, I will put my trust in Him. You got a better option than that? Now, there are some things that can happen. I can kind of sort through in my mind and kind of wrap my mind around some things. I read a news story of a group of hikers, and they're climbing Mount Shasta out in California in February, and there's an avalanche, and they're buried beneath the snow, and by the time that they get to them and by the time they find them, they have perished. And I read the story and I think, wow, it's horrible. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, maybe they should have taken some more precaution. Maybe climbing Mount Shasta in February was not a good idea. Or I hear about a policeman who is killed in the line of duty. And that's very sad. And my heart goes out to his family. But I do understand in the back of my mind, I do understand that there are certain jobs that carry certain risks of greater factor than others. But to be killed on a lonely highway by a drunk driver, to be struck down by a gunman when you're sitting in an assembly of worship, to have your home destroyed by a tornado, to come home from the doctor's office with a disease diagnosis that just hits you out of the blue and you're stunned. There's no good answers to any of this. There's no sensible pattern. There's no, as we say, rhyme or reason. And so all of us, I think, ask the unanswerable question. Why? And I think it is a natural question to ask. But the second question is a follow-up to the first. And the second question we ask so often is, well, what if? What if? And so somebody says, what if I had rearranged my schedule and that would have put me at a different place at a different time? What if I had taken another route? What if I had gone to another theater? What if I'd sent my daughter to a different school? What if and what if and what if? Do we really want the power that accompanies that question? The what if question? Do we really want to be able to know all of the events that are going to happen in the future to not only ourselves but to everyone we love? Do we really want to have that power? Well, if we do, we're wanting to be God. And that option, ladies and gentlemen, is not available to us. In Isaiah 45 and verse 5, he says very plainly, I am the Lord and there is no God besides me. So we're not Him. So what that means is the best thing that any of us can do is brace ourselves for the tragedies of life and endure them the best we can, and to take the roots of our faith and to keep putting them deeper and deeper and deeper. You know why assemblies like this are important? Because what we're doing is training. What we're doing is deepening the roots of our faith. Because the storm is going to come and the winds are going to blow. And are we going to be able to stand strong through all of that? This is where our faith has to kick in. What did we say Sunday? If your faith doesn't count in hard times, your faith doesn't count at all. And I think that's why some people weather the storms of life better than others. They learn to live in hope. Hope that in spite of this tragedy in my life, that life is still worth the living. And so they get out of bed every morning and they plant their feet on the floor and they're going to take it another day. Why? Because He lives. Don't we sing about that? Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know who holds the future. And life is worth the living because He lives. That's all about faith. That's all about deepening the roots of your faith. I will put my trust in Him. What if I don't understand Him? I will put my trust in Him. What if I don't understand His timing? I will put my trust in Him. What if something happens in my life and I can't answer the question? I will put my trust in Him. Period. That's what all of us have to do. Now, there's two stories, I think, that illustrate all of this. And both of them are right out of this book. And the first one is Job. Job chapter 1. When you read about Job in the first chapter, here is a man who is the picture of, well, he's a picture of prosperity, but he is also a picture of virtue. I mean, not only has he been very, very blessed financially, he was very dependable. I mean, he loved God. He had a great family. He was a very kind man. He's a very generous man. And yet, behind human eyes, there's a confrontation over the faithfulness of this God follower. And so I read in chapter 1, beginning in verse 9, then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Then the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Do I understand that? No. I can't take that passage beyond the words I just read. Sometimes people come up and they say, I just don't understand this confrontation between God and Satan about Job. I just read you everything I know about that. I can't go beyond that. I don't understand all of that. I understand that God gives Satan permission to make life hard on his servant. I understand that. I can begin to read and see that Satan takes away his wealth, Satan takes away his family, Satan takes away his health. Satan finally gets to the point, Job doesn't have anything left except his faith, and he struggles with that. Now, you and I have the privilege of turning over to the last chapter and see how it all comes out. You ever read fiction? And you're just starting to really get into it, and you go, I'm dying to find out how this is going to work out. So you cheat. You go read the last page. And you blow it for yourself. And we can do that with Job. We can go to the end and say, oh, okay, I see how it all works out. Job couldn't do that. Job's stuck in chapter 3, and Job's stuck in chapter 4 and 5 and 6, and he's having to live this every single day. The only thing Job knows is what he knows at the moment. And what he knows at the moment is loss. And what he knows at the moment is pain. And what he knows at the moment is just human misery. and suffering. And one time he said, I wish I'd have never been born. That's how bad it was. And then his friends show up. And the vast majority of the book of Job is about a conversation going on between Job and his friends. And here his friends march in, and their intent is to comfort him. But they don't comfort him. They pile on. They add to his suffering. You know why they added to his suffering? Because they tried to answer the unanswerable question. They tried to answer the why. And in their limited knowledge and wisdom, they said, well, you must be suffering because apparently you deserve it. Because everybody knows only bad people suffer. And Job is sitting there scratching his head. That didn't make any sense to him, any more than it makes any sense to you. But as you read on through the book, finally Job's perspective changes. When he comes to grip with God's unfathomable greatness. And by the time you get to the end of the book, chapter 40, 41, 42, Job realized he's been asking the wrong question the whole time. Up until then, he's been asking, why, Lord? Why? 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 And you know, God never answered that question. God never answered why. Until you get to the end of the book and Job realized, I've been asking the wrong question. I should have been asking who. Who is my God? And focusing on the power and the sovereignty and the rule of God in my life. And so when you get to chapter 40 and verse 3, Job answered the Lord and he said, behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand upon my mouth. At one point, Job said, I wish I had an audience with God. If I had an audience with God, I could surely reason with Him and He'd see my point of view and He would understand how unjust this is and all of that. And Job finally got that wish granted, and when he stood in the presence of God, he said, I don't have anything to say. And look at chapter 42 and verse 3. Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. He thought he knew. He thought his friends knew, or at least they thought they knew. But they didn't. And what Job learned? Job learned that behind what appeared to be random suffering for him was the existence of the Almighty on the throne. That God was still in control, that God was still on the throne, even when in Job's mind it appeared that life had fallen apart and God was nowhere to be found. And that's one of the things Job learned. But the other thing Job learned was that in suffering, God gave him tremendous power. Because God gave Job the power to choose his response to suffering. And Job's response to his suffering, unknown to Job, had repercussions in a whole other world, literally. And Job had no idea. Job and his life and his faith and his choices mattered to God. And so do yours. So do mine. Whatever choice you make in regard to suffering, and whatever choice you make in regard to the tragedies of your life, matter to God. And that's the message of the book of Job. That's the story of Job. And then there's the second story of Joseph. When you study the story of Joseph, it is blessing and betrayal, and blessing and betrayal, and blessing and betrayal. He is blessed by his father. He is betrayed by his brothers. He is blessed in the household of one of Egypt's leaders. He's betrayed by his master's wife. He's blessed again in prison and then betrayed by a man who went back on his promise and forgot all about him. But eventually, you know the story. Eventually, Joseph gets out of prison. He's released. He rises to the rank of chief administrator over all of the land of Egypt under Pharaoh. He oversees the storage of 7 years of grain during a great famine, and then the distribution of that grain. He oversees all of that. And guess who shows up in Egypt to buy food, to buy grain? In the book of Genesis says Joseph reveals himself to his family. There's a great family reunion. There's a lot of rejoicing. He moves his elderly father down to the land of Egypt, and there they live the rest of their lives. The end. You think that's the end? You really think that's the end? Because when I get to the end of the book of Genesis, that's about what I got right there. Apparently that's not the end, because I think there's a lot more else in here. That's not the end. That's not even the story. That's not the story. There's a whole other story. There's a second story behind the first story that Joseph didn't understand and never lived to see. Although Joseph suffered greatly, God would use that situation to overcome evil with good as a means to get his family down into the land of Egypt. They would grow into a great nation. They would become slaves. They would be led to freedom by a man named Moses. They would be given a law. They would be given a land. And through those people, a Messiah would come to save the world. And that's where you and I come into the story. How come there's so much taken up in the book of Genesis with the Joseph story? Do you understand the Joseph story takes up more space in Genesis than the story of anybody else? Why do you think that is? I think the Job and Joseph stories are there to remind all of us that our lives fit into a holy plan that goes well beyond what our minds can possibly begin to comprehend. Job and Joseph had no idea. They had no idea that their stories and the decisions that they would make about their faith would affect generations to come. That would affect lives yet unborn. But again, that's true for you and me. Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis 50, "You meant evil, but God meant good." Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and who are called according to His purpose. How does God do that? I don't know. Why does God use whatever timing I don't know. Can't answer those questions. But I know this. I will put my trust in Him. And I know that God's grace and God's providence can triumph over everything. But I've got to trust Him. Your life is like a great landscape that extends far beyond what you can see. And who knows how one experience that has happened in your life, as singularly horrible as it may be, can possibly set in motion a chain reaction of events that can bring about good for years to come that you may never live to see. God can triumph over whatever happens if we just let Him work in our lives. I will put my trust in Him. Let me leave you with two truths. Two questions, two stories, two truths. Number one, suffering is part of the freedom of choice. Did you know that? When God made us in the very beginning, He gave to man the freedom of choice. He made us a free moral agent, we say sometimes. In other words, we can make the choice to do what is right. We can make the choice to do what is wrong. Do you like that choice? Do you like that freedom to choose? God doesn't make you obey Him. God doesn't make you disobey Him. God doesn't make you treat other people the way you should. God doesn't make you make good choices and decisions. God doesn't make you do anything. You're free to choose. But so is everybody else. And some people, ladies and gentlemen, make bad choices. And they make really bad choices that not only affect themselves, but affect everybody else. When a guy decides to drink and then get behind the wheel of a car, that's a really bad decision, a bad choice he's made. When my relative makes a choice to leave his wife and little children and go shack up with his secretary, that's a really bad choice that affects a lot of people. It's like taking a rock and throwing it in the middle of a farm pond, and the waves go everywhere. Somebody goes in a house of worship, somebody goes in and starts shooting. Those are bad choices. Evil. But because some people make evil choices, do you want God to take away the right to choose that He gives to every single person, including you? You have the choice, as does everyone, to either obey God or disobey God. But some people choose to disobey. Secondly, suffering is no respecter of persons. Because we always say, why me, as if that's the question, and that's not the question. The real question is, why not me? What's so special about me that I can just expect and almost demand that God grant unto me a perfect life? Because I think sometimes that's what we're asking. God, give me the perfect life as we define it. Now, you can argue and you can say that these are innocent people out here and they don't deserve the suffering. I get that. That's true. But I want to leave you with something to think about. There have been times in my life that I've had to endure the bad that I didn't deserve. There have been times in your life when you've had to endure the bad that you didn't deserve. But there have been a lot more times in my life that I got the good, and I didn't deserve that either. And same for you. And that's what Job said. In Job 2 and verse 10, he turned to Mrs. Job and he said, shall we accept good from God and not adversity? A world of fairness may give us what we want, but I'm going to tell you, a world of grace will give us more than we've ever deserved. And how will you ever know the strength of your faith if your faith is not tested? Think about that. Where is the sense in senseless tragedy? I don't have all the answers to that. In fact, when it comes to human suffering, I got more questions than I have answers. But what I've learned, ladies and gentlemen, is I don't have to have the answers. All I have to do is put my trust in Him. Do not be overcome by evil. Overcome evil with good. May God help all of us to take the words of Scripture and to lift them off the page and to put them in our lives where we live. And may God help those of us who are parents and grandparents to lead our children to understand that things aren't always going to look fair and things aren't always going to go exactly as we want them to. But it's not going to rock our world of faith. And I'll tell you why that's important. Because one of these days you're going to be dead and gone. And these kids who've been watching their mama and their daddies and their grandpas and their grandmas are going to grow up and they're going to go through stuff on their own. And they're going to face all kinds of uncertainties and difficulties. And they're going to remember. You remember when Grandma got her diagnosis? You remember her faith? You remember when that happened to Grandpa? Do you remember his faith? Same thing with Mom, same thing with Dad. They're going to remember. Don't let them down. Give them something to remember. I will put my trust in Him. We sing this invitation song tonight. If you owe a duty to God because you're not a Christian, why don't you obey the gospel and become a child of the Father who sits on the throne? Doesn't mean all your problems are going to go away. It means that He's going to help you get through them. Can we help you tonight? Won't you come while we stand and sing?